Good afternoon, class. I am so excited to jump back in to where we left off on our sort of introduction to critical race theory and some really important concepts associated with that framework. So, if everyone's ready, let's just jump back on in. We were talking last time about understanding critical race theory. This was the outline we were going to go through, and we already started. We talked about the history of critical race theory, some central concepts of critical race theory, applications of the framework, and then, of course, frequent misunderstandings. We'll get there of critical race theory. And as always, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to put them here in the comments, email me, or get me a message on Blackboard. So we talked about the history of critical race theory. We learned about the father of critical race theory, who is Derek Bell, who is a very respected scholar and legal mind, who really was very frustrated with the result of Brown versus Board of Education, that quintessential case that desegregated schools under the law in the United States. Derek Bell thought that that result was frustrating because nothing had actually changed in society, although the law had changed, although some things had been solidified in law, in practice, and in society, nothing had changed. And that was, in fact, his worst fear, that there was no equality. And during this time, Dr. King was leading a struggle toward equality, and people were very, very committed to that struggle. Black people were very committed to that struggle. And part of that struggle was to speak the truth. And critical race theory is sort of one of those truths that comes out of this movement. We talked about the founders of critical race theory, Professor Crenshaw, Professor Delgado, Professor Matsuda, and Professor Lawrence III. In their various areas of expertise, they come together to found critical race theory and learn about not just race, but the way that race intersects with these other classes, such as gender and ability. And so those were the founders of critical race theory. And then last time we left off talking about some central concepts of critical race theory. We first looked deeper into the definition of this phrase, and we dealt with this idea that racism is the father of race and not the other way around. So many times, and this is a misconception that I read when I was looking at some of your discussions of race and you. And it is okay if you said something like race was created and then we used race to divide us into classes and then people started to discriminate based on race. I get why you think that, because that is a common belief in society. However, if you trace back the founding of this country, if you trace back the ideas surrounding race, and if you trace back the way that racism started to come about, or we started to see racism, it was really this idea of material determinism, really this idea that people wanted to gain material comforts, wealth, possessions, and all of the morals, whether good or bad, all of the norms, the culture sort of stems from those needs, that need for material progress. And so racism was a system that was built to divide and classify people so that some people could do well and so that some people could stay in the position that they were in, and so that there could be this huge gap in prosperity and in power, among other things. And because of that, race was born. And the definition of race has changed. So you see there the definition of critical race theory. It's a theoretical approach. It's a framework of legal analysis. It really analyzes, dissects the laws and how they affect us using that lens of race and racism. We learned that race is not biological. Google it, guys. There's nothing genetic about race. Race is not a biological concept. It is a man-made concept. And so if race is not a biological category, it must be a sociological tool to organize society in order to dictate and maintain certain political, social, and economic objectives, goals, and disparities. Those are differences. Some people high, some people low. Think the haves and the have-nots. And these societal objectives are carried out through the implementation of social systems. Those are the systems in which we live, the social structures and practices, our governments, our laws, our institutions, our education systems, all of those things. Those objectives are carried out when we implement them in those social systems, those structures, and those policies, and which were created to maintain those inequalities. And so we learned that race is a social and political construct. It was not created by God, and it was not created by nature. It's a man-made social phenomenon, which was the result of policies. They were the result of racist policies intended to control power, resources, and opportunity. So these policies were created that said, you certain people have to be low and you certain people have to be high. And then we had to justify those policies. We had to give reasoning for those policies, and race was born. And then sort of all these negative ideas and stereotypes that that sort of come along with race. We talked about how racism is normal, it's ordinary. The United States was literally built, founded from the moment that it was founded on policies and practices that were intended to create advantages for some at the very expense of others. Ever since the Constitution, when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, saying that all men were created equal, wrote the Constitution, saying, and the Declaration of Independence, saying that everybody has the right to life, liberty, and property, and to pursue happiness and prosperity, when in fact they own slaves. Racism is normal. Race is intersectional. Our system of race is linked very closely and really unable to be detangled from other categories of oppression, other areas in which society oppresses people based on our gender, based on our class, based on our ability or disability, and based on our religion, to name a few. And then we dealt with the concept of differential racialization that says that race and racism take on different shapes at different times in order to serve the interests of the dominant class. And that's fascinating, guys. It's fascinating because you could literally cross a state border and your race would change. If you think about at certain points in time, race was based on the race of the mother. If your mother was white, you were white. If your mother was Black, you were Black. There was also this one drop rule that if you just had one drop of Black blood in you, whatever that meant, that you were Black. And so all of these different ways that race was defined, and it wasn't a coincidence. The definition of race changed in order to serve the interest of the dominant class. And so in speaking about the interest of the dominant class builds these systems and structures to benefit itself. And that is this idea, the concept of institutional and systemic oppression. Racism without racists. It's funny that if you ask people if they are racist, most people will probably say absolutely not. I've never had a person admit that they were racist. Absolutely not. However, all of them will also tell you probably that they think racism exists. How can it be? How can it be that we all know that racism exists, but there are no racists? And there's a lot of potential discussion around that and explanation. But one of the ways is that the individualized bigotry, the individualized prejudices are not necessarily what critical race theory is primarily concerned with. Although those ideas and those issues like stereotyping, and later we'll talk about microaggressions, those do very much stem from the institutional and systemic oppression and systemic racism. But critical race theory analyzes closely the systems and structures, the institutions, and the way that they oppress. And that is where the racism lies. And that is why groups find it difficult to prosper and grow, because the racism is not as much in the individuals, but in the institutions themselves, because they were built that way. Systemic oppression exists at the level of institutions, harmful policies and practices, and across structures like the education system, the healthcare system, transportation, economy. All of these things are interconnected, they're all related, and they all are reinforcing. They all reinforce each other. They all legitimize and build upon each other. So someone who has a poor education due to systemic racism may also not do well economically, may also not travel well transportation wise, may also not have access to good healthcare because of systemic poverty and things like that. So oppression and systemic mistreatment, such as racism, classism, sexism, or homophobia, it's more than just the sum of individual prejudices. That means it's more than just a whole bunch of people are racist. It's more than just how I feel or how you feel or how white people feel about Black people or Latinos or how Black people feel about white people or how white people feel about Asian people. All of those feelings and the sum total of them. Systemic racism, institutional oppression still is not born out of that. You still don't get to the level, even if you aggregate all the racist ideas in the world, you still do not aggregate to the level of institutional and systemic racism. Those ideas are something that is built into the fabric of the systems and institutions. Systemic oppression is systematic. There is a system to it. There is an order, a procedure. It operates in a very organized way. There's an organization to it and has historical antecedents. That means when you look at something in the system that's racist, you can trace its origin back. You can trace the origin of the systemic racism in our country right now back all the way to systemic racism, dating all the way back to slavery. It is the intentional. It is intentional. It is not about the prejudices that we hold without trying, without knowing. It is the intentional disadvantaging of groups of people based on their identity, while advantaging members of the dominant group, the dominant gender, the dominant race, the dominant class, the dominant sexual orientation, the dominant language here, English. The way that our systems are built, they intentionally keep some people in and some people out. And that is what critical race theory examines. And just some applications of critical race theory very quickly. One of those being the Texas voting bill. How so? How so? By changing the way that we vote, you know this. By changing how we vote, it changes who votes. The how is the system. The how is the procedure. The how is that systematic organization. By changing how we vote, the bill changes who votes, not the other way around. For example, it forbids drive-through polling places and 24-hour voting. So people who get off work, usually working class people, often people of color, who work after the voting polls are closed, can't vote. Can't vote. Forbids sending voters unsolicited absentee ballot applications and from promoting the use of voting by mail. So if you don't have time to register, or if you don't have access to internet, you can't just get a ballot in the mail that you didn't ask for. Empowers partisan poll watchers, allows people who are affiliated with a certain political party to monitor the way people vote, creates new criminal and civil penalties for those who work the polls, and erects barriers for those that help voters who need assistance. So people who perhaps don't have a certain level of education, people who are perhaps differently abled or disabled, those people are also disadvantaged. So this bill the way that it is organized disadvantages poor people, people of color, the disabled. So this is one example of how systemic inequality, systemic injustice can be embedded into policy. This is an application of critical race theory, the Texas voting bill. So let's look more closely at the structural analysis of the voting bill. The bill put in place a new policy that will systematically disadvantage certain voters, such as non-traditional workers, caregivers, low-wage voters, and disabled votes will find it harder to participate in voting. These voters tend to be Black, Latino, young, unmarried, etc. The disabled, the hospitalized, the antisocial, and older voters will find it more difficult to vote. Communities that have been historically mistreated by law enforcement will be less likely to participate in voting or encourage their family member and community members to do so. You see these criminal penalties, these poll watchers that are there, people who are afraid, communities that do not have a positive relationship with law enforcement aren't going to want to go where law enforcement is. In high population and urban areas, voters will be discouraged by longer lines, confusing voting procedures because no one can help them, remember? Environmental condition, and few voting advocates to help you out. And then finally, the last thing we want to talk about, and we can talk about this some more, frequent misunderstandings of critical race theory. Myth one, all white people are racist. That is not a tenet of critical race theory. No critical race theorist has held that all white people are racist. Critical race theory says that the system is racist, and that insofar as we all participate in the racist system, we all, of course, bear some responsibility for its perpetuation. But that is not pointing fingers at one group and saying that all of that group, i.e. white people, are racist. That is not a tenet of critical race theory. That critical race theory is reverse racism. Critical race theory does not hold that any group ought to be mistreated or that any group ought to experience bigotry or prejudice. Critical race theory discusses the foundation, the historical and legal foundation of our country, and views it through a critical race lens so that we can understand more about it. Critical race theory myth number 3 is not taught in K through 12 schools. It never will be. It is taught in colleges where you are and in law schools because it is a comprehensive legal framework. And finally, diversity, equity, and inclusion training is the same as critical race theory, which just isn't true. Learning about diversity, learning about equity and inclusion, those are just ways to help and assist employers and different organizations in going about being sensitive and implementing proper procedures and protocols to make itself more inclusive. However, that is not the same as critical race theory. That is not the same as the examination of the critical framework of our country. So if you have any questions about critical race theory, please, please, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to discuss with you. I hope your case study discussions and writing is going well. If you need any help whatsoever, please, please, please give me a shout. Thanks so much, and I look forward to talking with you all.